to a knight, chivalry is the most important code of honor. To be a symbol of bravery, honesty, and compassion, to devote yourself to thy king and country, and to perform thy duties as a proper champion to the people. Only those who honored this code with their own life could call themselves a true knight. And Sir Daniel Wigginbottom Fortesque, captain of the Royal Army, was not one of those knights. Born in 1254 in the kingdom of Gallowmere, Dan grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was a conniving, cheating, lying, cowardly, pathetic little man. The only reason he even got his role as captain was because his father had money, and because the king's royal advisor heavily pushed for it. Oh, and did I mention that the royal advisor was actually an evil necromancer named Zarok who was planning to overthrow the kingdom with an army of demons and undead? Because that's probably why he pushed so hard for it. When the war broke out, Dan was at the front lines. He fought bravely, valiantly, and led his army to victory, single-handedly finishing off Zarok, sacrificing himself for the sake of his homeland. I'm kidding. He died to the first arrow seconds after the battle started. Everything I just described, though, was the false narrative passed down for the next 100 years, up until Zarok returned for a second attempt to take over Gallowmere, once again raising the undead to do so. Except he accidentally brought Fortesque back as well. And this time, Dan was ready to show some spine and redeem himself. Getting shot in the eye really humbles a person, I suppose. While Dan was finally able to live up to the legend made up for him, will that be enough to take on the many other legends that exist in Super Smash Bros? Only time will tell. So getting right into things, I see Dan as a pretty heavy character. Dude can take a lot of punishment, but he is also kinda sluggish as a result. He'd have 2 jumps and no additional movement options. Just like with Ratchet, Sly, Sackboy, and Raiden, Dan was in PlayStation All-Stars, but I did not look at that game for this moveset. Anyway, with that said, despite Dan only joining the Royal Guard to impress the maidens, he did apparently show some amount of natural talent. Unfortunately, he was also very lazy, so he never really got the proper training needed to fight like a knight. He does improve over time after resurrecting, but that clumsiness will still be quite apparent throughout this moveset. He can get the job done, but not without a little dumb luck and a wide assortment of weapons gifted to him through his efforts. His main weapon of choice for this moveset, though, will be his trusty enchanted broadsword given to him by the hero Woden the Mighty, using it for a good chunk of his attacks. Like his jab, for instance. He can have a 3-hit jab that has Dan swing his sword forward diagonally for the first 2 hits, then end it with a stab to launch foes away. This will be a jab, however, that can be cancelled into a rapid jab, where instead of the stab, Dan will keep swinging his sword forward wildly, almost in a panic. This is the first example of a move that shows Dan's slight inexperience. If you calmly tap the button 3 times, he'll use a proper sword combo. But if you mindlessly mash it like some brainless skeleton, he loses his composure and just starts swinging, hoping for the best. Dan's dash attack can be his power lunge from the Medievil remaster, Resurrection. It's a simple stinger attack, having him lunge out of his dash to stab his sword forward and launch away anyone hit by it. The side tilt can be Dan's slash attacks from Resurrection. This is an automatic 2-hit attack, starting with Dan swinging his sword horizontally forward, then immediately following it up with a second swing into the other direction. The first swing deals hit stun, the second swing launches foes away. The up tilt can be his cut up attack, another automatic 2-hit strike that starts with Dan swinging his sword upward vertically, then automatically swinging it back down to hit the ground. The 2 hits of this up tilt will both launch opponents, with the upward swing launching foes into the air, and the downward swing sending foes 6 feet under, spiking them, making it a potentially deadly move for edge guarding if you can time it properly, or simply to bounce them into the air if it spikes them into the stage. With this move, there's no purgatory here, it's heaven or hell, there's no in between. Getting into Dan's down tilt, well, actually, before we do, I gotta go over another major tool that he'll be taking full advantage of. His golden shield, gifted to him by the shield-obsessed hero, Carl Sterngard. Dan will have the same shield gimmick that the Lynx and the heroes have. Whenever Dan idles, walks, or crouches, he'll hold his shield forward. And his shield will nullify all incoming projectiles, only slightly pushing Dan back whenever he blocks one. There are certain attacks that can also block projectiles as well, like his down tilt. This can have Dan shove his shield forward. Not the greatest poking tool, and its range is lacking compared to most of his other attacks, but it's quite safe to use from the front, and it can be made as a pretty good get-off-me tool. This is very useful since, as I'm sure you've already picked up on, to make up for Fortesque's kind of sluggish movement, he has really good disjoint and range, so any option to keep opponents off of you is always welcome. Speaking of range, his side smash will have some of the greatest. He can use the gift from the Amazonian hero Imanzi Shongama, the Throwing Spear. This is a long-range projectile side smash, having Dan throw a gravity-affected spear. You can slightly angle the spear up or down and can deal quite a hefty amount of hurt with it, especially from a distance. The spear will actually deal more knockback if it lands from further away. But of course, good luck actually landing it from that far off. You'd either need some great aim or some great luck, which Dan does have quite an abundance in. I mean, except for the whole arrow to the eye thing, but who's really keeping track? Dan's up smash can be one of his most powerful. He calls upon the lightning given to him by the hero of old, Megwin Stormbringer. Dan lifts his hand into the air, conjuring powerful staticky electricity to emit from it. Anyone smited by the fury of the Fortesque will take constant multi-hitting damage and be launched into the air afterward. While this is his strongest smash attack, it's also the one that will likely leave him the most vulnerable, since it only hits above Dan, not to his sides, and it also has quite a bit of end lag, so bear that in mind. For Dan's down smash, he can pull out his trusty Warhammer, the gift from the mighty Stenir Iron Hewer. Dan uses it to smash the ground in front of himself, causing a powerful shockwave that expands outwards on both sides of Dan. Getting hit by that shockwave deals a modest amount of damage and knocks opponents into the air. But the real danger is getting hit by the hammer itself, because that deals nearly twice the damage and it launches foes horizontally, making it another potentially nasty edge-guarding tool if timed properly. Of course, timed properly is the key phrase there, since this is one of Dan's slowest attacks, both to come out and to recover from. Kinda hard to swing around a top-heavy hammer like that when you literally don't have the triceps for it. In which case, for Dan's aerials, his neutral air can have him use an aerial version of the 360-degree slash from Resurrection, having Dan spin his torso a single time to swing his sword all around himself, hitting horizontally from front to back. The forward air can be his normal jumping slash, having him swing his sword forward from high to low. Simple but reliable. The back air can be an aerial version of his back lunge attack from Resurrection, having Dan stab his sword straight behind himself. It requires a bit of precision, but it hits pretty hard and comes out decently fast compared to his other attacks. The up air can have Dan take his shield and swing it above himself from front to back. Like with his down tilt, his shield doesn't have quite as much range as his other weapons, but it covers a lot of area and it's hard to beat out, so it is another pretty safe move to use. Then for his down air, he can thrust his sword straight down. A pretty typical down air that can spike if landed properly, sending opponents down even lower than Dan's self-esteem. Dan will grab opponents with one arm and pummel by slapping them silly. Dan's forward throw can have him return to his days as the captain of the King's croquet team, and/or when he made a cameo in Everybody's Golf, and use his hammer to hit the foe away. Except since his hammer is so large, he kinda loses his balance after completing the swing. The back throw has him turn to chuck the foe back as hard as he can, though he overexerts himself and his arm falls off as a result, so he has to hurriedly reattach it. The up throw has him fight kinda dirty and kicks the foe from below to launch them into the air. But Karma rears its ugly head and he swings his foot a little too high, causing him to fall over. Then for the down throw, Dan jumps over the foe and brings them to the ground with his full body weight, then stomps on their back a few times in a tantrum. But then Dan somehow slips on the foe like a banana peel, causing them to be launched forward and Dan falling to the ground. It should be noted that all of these clumsy ending animations that each throw has do not count as end lag. They only play out if you let them, meaning they can be cancelled. They're mostly just there for gags. For Daniel Fortesque's neutral special, he could use the very first weapon given to him in the Hall of Heroes, gifted by his former comrade in arms, Canny Tim, Dan could use the crossbow. This move allows Dan to fire small and weak arrow projectiles straight forward. Their range is decent, but nothing to write home about, and each shot deals small flinching damage. Dan is also able to walk around and do a single jump while firing. Really, the best thing to compare it to is Banjo-Kazooie's Breagle Blaster, just slightly weaker but with more range. On top of that, if the arrows hit a wall, they'll actually ricochet off into a random direction. Decent for potentially catching opponents off guard, but this probably will be one of the least seen properties of the move. For Dan's side special, he could use his Daring Dash. Holding his shield forward, Dan charges straight ahead, knocking away anyone in his path, though he will stop if he hits certain somethings or someone. Despite all the crummy things Dan's done when he was alive, at least he's not a hit and runner. You are able to jump mid-dash, and it can be used in the air for a decent amount of horizontal recovery, though Dan will soon start to fall during the aerial dash. The Daring Dash also won't put him into free fall, but it can only be used in the air once at a time. It should also be noted that, since Dan holds his shield forward during it, he'll not only block incoming projectiles, but projectiles are also the only thing that won't interrupt Dan's dash. He'll just ignore them entirely. Next, for Dan's up special, taking a note from the hero of Hyrule, the hero of Gallowmere could use his own Spin Slash, though Dan's will be a lot more intricate than Link's. Like Link, Dan spins in circles with his sword held out, though Dan only spins his torso. On the ground, Dan remains planted, and in the air, using it gives Dan vertical lift while he spins, then goes into free fall afterward. You can even hold the button down to charge the spin and increase its damage. That, however, is where the similarities end. Dan is able to charge the move in the air, and is overall able to keep charging for quite a bit, but you can only activate the spin once you let the button go. If you charge for too long, the charge will cancel itself. That's the only way to cancel the charge, by the way. Otherwise, you have to activate the spin. While charging, Dan is able to walk around and do a single jump. Plus, he always holds his shield forward as he charges, making it impossible to interrupt his charge with projectiles from the front. Charging also not only increases the damage the attack deals, it increases the amount of times he spins, adding more to the spin time if used on the ground, and increasing the amount of vertical recovery if used in the air. Opponents hit by Dan's sword while he spins will always be launched away on contact, and it's pretty powerful in its own right, making for a decent kill option. Additionally, while Dan is spinning on the ground, he is able to walk forward while he does, so opponents who might think they're just out of range really still aren't safe. And of course, if used in the air, you can hold left or right on the control stick to slightly move Dan into those directions as he rises. Despite that, the vertical lift isn't really all that spectacular. Honestly, Dan's recovery probably is one of his weakest aspects in this moveset. Then lastly, for Dan's down special, he could use the weapon of one Bloodmanoth Skull Cleaver, the Battle Axe. Quiz time, everyone! How do you think Sir Daniel Fortesque uses this axe? Does he A, cut down trees, B, swing it forward at high power, C, throw it like a boomerang, or D, chop down a bridge into a lava pit below? If you picked C, you were right. What? Activating down special has Dan throw his axe straight forward as a projectile, then after flying a set distance, automatically returns to him regardless of his position. If it hits anything while flying forward, that will force it to turn around sooner, and on its way back to Dan, nothing can interrupt it aside from reflectors, and it can damage opponents as it flies back to Dan. It overall doesn't deal a whole lot of knockback, but it hits pretty hard, though that damage does weaken after boomeranging back to Dan. It deals the most damage while flying forward. Also, as you can probably guess, Dan can't use his down special again until the axe returns to him. He only has one, and he can't exactly throw an axe that isn't in his hand. The axe, along with his crossbow, probably would act as Dan's best neutral tools, poking at foes from afar if they aren't careful. They shouldn't be too much of an issue to deal with, though. Just keep an eye out and... Oh, I am so sorry. As I said, to make up for his sluggish and clumsy nature, Dan comes prepared with a wide variety of disjointed and long-range options to keep his opponents at bay. He's not exactly the most graceful fighter, and he doesn't exactly have the hamstrings to pull off any strings. Dan relies more on heavy hits and full awareness of his spacing to avoid getting overwhelmed. Keep that in mind, and he'll do just fine. for Sir Daniel Fortesque's final smash. I call it For the Honor of Gallowmere. It's a cinematic final smash where Dan calls upon the power of the Chalice of Souls. He holds the chalice overhead, causing it to release a large burst of souls all around Daniel, and anyone hit by the souls will be pulled into quite the jaw-dropping spectacle. Sorry. The cinematic plays out on a battlefield, with the souls forming into the skeletal spirits of Gallowmere's army. Once Dan gives the signal, they all charge at the Quat foes. The spirits rack up tons of damage as they gang up on the Quat foes. The final smash ends with Dan dropping in with his magic sword and striking the final blow, ending the cinematic, after which all caught foes are launched away. For Daniel's colors, his default has him in his usual silver knight armor. The first alt can make his armor red, a potential reference to the dark wizard Zarok. The second can make his armor a light blue. This can reference Princess Kia, the 91st consort to Ramses II, as well as Dan's true love. Next is orange armor, an alt to reference pumpkins, a common fruit seen in Medieval. Then here's a light purple armor set. This references Dan's gaudy custom-made royal armor shown in the digital Medieval comic, Fate's Arrow. Now for his last three alts, they can all be costumes, with the first showing Dan in his dragon armor, obtained when he beat the mean old dragon. His second can be his Victorian dinner suit, as shown in Medieval 2. And lastly is his golden super armor, created when Dan shook hands and fused with his past self. Don't think about it too hard. For his stage intro, Dan appears from a spiral of magic, the same kind used to help him reach the Hall of Heroes. For taunts, his first can have him try to show some modicum of respect and give a bow, except his head falls off when he leans forward, leading him to clumsily catch it. We see him accidentally do this when he first formally introduces himself to Princess Kia. For the second, Dan has a bone to pick. He snaps into a battle pose, possibly the same kind seen during the loading screens of the first game, and during it, he mumbles, This is a common thing Dan will say to people whenever they talk down to him. And for his last, he pulls out a chicken drum and waves it into the air while trying to make clucking sounds to insult his opponents. This taunt references the nature of chicken drums and how they were used as an item to literally turn enemies into roast chicken. It also calls back to Zarok that one time he clucked like a chicken. And finally, for Daniel Fortesque's victory animations, his first shows him out of breath, somehow, but once he notices the camera, he quickly composes himself and strikes a cool-looking pose. His second has Dan put his foot on top of a random gravestone and pose triumphantly, mimicking how he looks on the box art of the Medieval PS4 remake. And if we wanted to be extra disrespectful, the gravestone could list off the name of one of the losers. Then the final could have Dan jump in with some somersaults and backflips and land with a chalice falling into his hand for him to chug down. When he tries to, though, the drink spills all over his armor. This is a direct reference to the true ending of Medieval, when Dan is finally accepted into the Hall of Heroes. And that does it for What If Sir Daniel Fortesque was in Smash? So, if you enjoyed what you saw and would like to see even more characters be given possible Smash movesets, be sure to subscribe. And if you want to support the show, you can click the join button below the video, the one on my main page, or the link in the description to become a sponsor for my channel. Doing so will get you access to my Discord server, channel emotes, as well as the option to watch these episodes early, on top of so much more. And of course, if you have a character that you want to see be given a possible Smash moveset, leave a comment down below, or contact me on Twitter at BrawlFan1 on Twit. I hope you all enjoyed, thank you so much for watching, and have a happy Halloween, everyone!